Yeah. So Reverend, there are a few questions that we've been discussing and we wanted to ask you, and I think people will join in, but I just wanted to begin.
Okay.
And one of the things that you said several times in these past couple of days is you've talked about Western civilization and the violence that is inherent in it. And I think you've said in the past that the children of the world are being sabotaged by Western civilization. And
By the way,
are being sabotaged by Western civilization. And I just wanted you to speak a little bit more on how you define Western civilization, what you mean by it, and if you think, what do you see it being replaced by?
yeah, okay. Well, you see, that's a very hard question because as I have lived in my country, I think a major political assumption is, and has been, not mine, but a popular by power brokers, that the world suffers because of people outside of the United States and systems outside of the United States, not because of the continuation of the Western discovery, conquest, wealth-seeking movements of the 16th century. So it's the terrorists now who are the trouble. Not that the terrorists are a creation of our several decades of foreign policies and economic policies and military policies. And before the terrorists, it was the communists. The Cold War, see. In Vietnam, it was the communists. In Africa, it was the communists, the ANC. And that really doesn't come from anywhere except from Western civilization, as it's been, as that period of 600 years has been appropriated and handled and used and shaped by the United States power brokers and leaders. So it's never our use of slavery that hasn't caused any harm. It's never the conquest of the Indian that has put poison into our history. It's always those people who are at fault. So it's not our, in a sense, it's not our military occupation in so many different countries, and the presence of our CIA. It's never that. It's always those people, you people. So I see that as a part of what I mean by Western civilization. If, as in, let's say, on Nicaragua, there was counter-violence, the violence that Daniel Ortega and his people in their own country developed is reactive violence. It's a reaction to the USA business interest and military interest and the development of the military of Nicaragua. So let's see, I'm trying to think of the name of the Archbishop of Brazil, who uses that analogy, says years ago, decades ago in Brazil, this Roman Catholic Archbishop of Recife called I'll try to describe it. The first violence is the system that imposes violence on the people. Economic, social, cultural, spiritual violence. And then people react to it. He calls it the spiral of violence. The first violence is so I would suggest the first violence is Western civilization conquest and wealth gathering. The second violence then is reaction to that violence. I can't think of this man. Anyway.
Was it Frei Beto?
Beg pardon?
Was his name Frei Beto?
No. Well, let's go on.
Reverend, but at what point in history would you say this Western civilization comes into being?
At what point?
In history. I mean, when is it, do you think this force in history begins?
Sometime in the 16th century, when especially the Portuguese began to go up and down the coast of Africa and landed in South America and North America, began to claim land and look for gold and wealth. I think that's the beginning of the massive discovery of the earth that Europe did. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
And then it became settlers going to where there's lots of land. And in many ways, Europe in that century was more of a closed society. The lands were pretty largely owned by the nobility and the kings and queens in England and Italy and France and Germany and Bulgaria. So there was not land that people could settle on and farm on, except as sharecroppers, what we call in the United States sharecroppers. And and that's a major reason why so many people fled from Europe, England, Ireland to North America.
The enclosures.
The land hungry, yeah, they could not find land. And it's why they were also so adamant that the army should move ahead of them in the United States. The Congress should finance the army, and the army would move ahead of them and kill off the Indians, conquer them, get rid of them so that they could then settle on the land. And there are a lot of books in the West. There are a lot of Western novels. There are a lot of cowboy Indian novels. There are a lot of Indian settler novels that describe this, where the novelist has been honest about the reality. And I think it's General Sherman of the Civil War and post-Civil War years that said that the army was the best friend the Indian had because they were soft on killing them off. They felt that they were that it was an invasion and that the Indians ought to be respected and could be moved to reservations, but they did not think the wars against them were that valid. Many did not. No doubt some soldiers did, but many did not. I would say to you that there were two units of the army, the 9th and the 10th cavalry units that were all black, led by white officers, And they became the major army in Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, a little, Arizona. And it's that group of black men, many of them ex-slaves, who were the army in that part of western part of the country, who fought the Apaches and the Sioux and would never. Some historians say that their work has never been appreciated or really acknowledged by the folk who settled in those sections of huge land areas. But they're very interesting stories.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to the second part of that question. So as you're saying, Western civilization and its violence, it starts with the transatlantic slave trades and the genocide in the 16th, 17th centuries.
Well, I'm not actually prepared to hang on to that. That's one perspective. But there's there are other possibilities. The Europeans had, in the medieval years, a sense of what they called the other. Any number of major stories on babies raised by wolves out of Germany and out of the heart of Eastern Europe. So they had a notion of that life is divided into two sections, that there are those of us who are like ourselves, there are those who are other. That was, according to a number of the anthropologists and the historians, that was a strong sensibility, even perhaps a spirituality that came out of Europe. And so when people from Asia, dark-skinned people, fled military conquest and came into Eastern Europe, what we call the gypsies are descendants of the dark-skinned people who escaped military conquest. They became the gypsies and outcast people in Europe. What is that, the 11th century or the 9th century? Then the Moors, the Islamic people, came in one of those 2 centuries. So that's both of those invasions, or both of those historical experiences in Europe, strengthened this business that our civilization is a superior civilization in Europe. It also strengthened the notion that Jesus Christ is Savior of the world and your religions are inferior. So our civilization is superior, and your civilizations are inferior. I think that's a strong force that developed and matured the encroachment of Western civilization. And Western civilization was in some ways the first, though there may be questions about it, that took gunpowder and turned it into technology, guns and cannon. I think Western Europe did that before anyone else did it. So the wedding between technology, science, and violence really was heavily advanced in the Western world, not in Africa, not in Asia.
But the second part of that question that I wanted to come to was thinking about the alternative, which partly we talked about Gandhi.
Well, the first alternative, it seems to me, is not that China or India becomes the major powers, or South Africa. The second alternative, I think, the option is, that through international travel and associations and organizations of one kind or another, and the UN, that a world order begin to emerge in many, many different ways. That is an order that will allow for the world to become different and to overthrow where it needs to be overthrown, the Western advantage.
Right, right. Which is, and you lived through the Bandung conference. And were you in India when that happened? In
Yes.
1955? And so I want you to
And-
speak about the significance of that conference.
Yeah, the Bandung Conference, and also the United States advancing its military wall against the Soviet Union across Asia, and all. So both of those events, it seems to be important. But the Bandung Conference, of course, was the critical one in which India played a major role in organizing, and Indonesia, and where the invitation was to those nations of color who had been under the governance of a Western nation. That was the invitation. And of course, the United States did not like that at all, and said it was essentially a communist and anti-American conference.
Yeah.
Because we have to understand, the United States became the primary power of the West, out of the Spanish-American War primarily. But for 100, for the 20th century, 21st century, we're still the power, economic, militarily, that Europe tends to follow.
They tried to bomb actually a plane carrying a Chinese premier to Bandung, but the premier wasn't on the plane, but the plane was Indian chartered by Air India, and it was called the Kashmir Princess. And
it was bombed. I don't remember.
it was
those
en route
details.
to the Bandung.
Yeah. But Bandung scared the heck out of some power brokers in the United States. That there's going to be a unity of Africa and Asia against the rest of us. So.
And do you see
I'm
that?
sorry, this is not flu or cold, this is allergy. It's an allergy and it crops up every so often. I took medicine this morning for it, but can't always be sure the medicine's that helpful. I thought it was drying up, but it's not. Yeah, it's still irritable. Yeah.
I actually had a question, going back to some of the points you were making about the earlier period of Christianity, actually. I mean, you had mentioned war and all of these other forces, but religion, and it seems to me that what Western civilization did was corrupt Christianity as a practice, and the origins.
I'd agree.
And the
I have no argument.
and if you could say, I mean,
The Europeanization of Jesus has been a great distortion of Christianity. Yeah.
And the Crusades,
Yeah, 11th century
the
Crusades,
othering of
yeah.
the othering that you spoke of comes so much. The Turk was, the devil. All of these Muslim groups became demonized during the 13th and 14th century, and then of course Africa is more advanced than Europe during this period, because Europe
Yes,
is
and
beautiful.
India too. India was more
And
advanced
India.
than some other places in the world. The cities of the cities of the Aztecs were more advanced than the cities of Europe. So a lot of that is well established by the the historians and paleontologists and whatnot. Yeah, that's quite true. Africa, Asia, that was quite known. So this imposition of the Western orientation was really a conquest effort.
And an attempt at Christian hegemony over
Yeah.
Islam.
Yeah. Oh yes, there's no doubt about it. We're the only religion, yeah. We're the only faith. Yeah, obviously, that has always been untrue. Yeah. Yeah. By the time I was in high school, I not only had a deep sense that I was called to become a pastor of local churches, but I was also deeply convinced that racism was sin and unjust and had to be always opposed. And then in high school, I met anti-Roman Catholic and anti-Jewish stuff. So that persuaded me that the religion of Jesus was actually for human life and not opposed to human life and human endeavor. And so I became an opponent of all forms of religious or nationalist bias in high school. And that's still a major perspective with me. So the religion of Jesus was distorted. It was wrapped up in dogma, and I began to meet it in the United States in high school. And the so-called evangelical group in the United States is a group that is fundamentally a cultural ideology and commitment and not oriented to the religion of Jesus. And this is where Howard Thurman helped me a good bit in 49-50 in his little book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which is still a very fine little book. And that was the first time I read a scholar's account. That was the first time I read a scholar's account that the religion of Jesus is really a religion for people. I think Thurman says it's really for people. It's a religion for people who have their backs up against the wall.
Right.
Something like that. Yeah. So it's a survival kit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I resonated with that back when the book was published, and I think that's still true. But all religions, of course, become cultural features in their own countries, in their own climate. And so Christianity isn't any different with the conquest, and as the Roman Empire took over the leadership, at least, of Christianity in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, Christianity became wedded to the kings and to the armies, and therefore became a part of the conquest. I think there's no doubt in my mind that that's precisely what happened. And Karenga, who thinks that St. Augustine was a black man, which he probably was, and an African, yet St. Augustine, in some of his theological perspective, does help the conquest of Christianity, the wedding of Christianity to a political power and to armies.
City of God.
Huh?
City of God.
Yes, right. Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that in my own mind.
The question, I was wondering if you could talk about the influence of W.E.B. Du Bois in the civil rights movement, and if he was influential to your understanding of the world.
Not sure I hear the question right.
She's asking about the influence of W.E.B. Du Bois on the civil rights movement, and if he's influenced your personal thinking.
Well, I did not begin to read Du Bois until after I'd made strong commitments in high school against injustice and bigotry of other people. I think that the intellectual world tends to be a help to broadening one's understanding, but after the event, not before the event. I'm not prepared to say that the black intellectual world is what caused my activity. It did not. So I don't know about other people. The black intellectual world is something I began to understand in college and ever since, but not before my own awareness. I would say that Frederick Douglass had more, his historic agitation across the 19th century had more to do with the creation of struggle and movement than any of the intellectual perspectives. Now that's my perspective, looking at it. I've become much more a reader of black books after high school than before high school. I don't even know if I had read one during high school, but then I don't remember everything I was reading in high school. So I really don't know. The intellectual pursuit, I think, is largely an observation and after major events pursuit, rather than before major event pursuit. I may be wrong about that,
But I mean, we were talking yesterday, and when we were talking about how Dr. King went through this training in Western philosophy, and I mean, it seems to me that he did intellectually pursue, all of these philosophers, and then intellectually pursue all those books by Gandhi before he came to a method that he found satisfying.
Yeah, but I have a study and research issue because the question, and I never got a chance to talk to King about this, because I didn't know enough about the Montgomery experience too. That was true because his book was the first major book, 58. I have not been able to find a place where Martin King talks about nonviolence between December 1st, 1955 and January 30th, 1956. In those 8 weeks that the bus boycott was organizing and forming and launched, he does not use the word nonviolence. He does not use the term soul force or spiritual struggle. He shapes his speeches in those days, early days, entirely around Christian love and the ethics of Jesus. So I'm bewildered by the fact that it's only on January 30th, at the bombing of his house while he's in a mass meeting, and 4 or 5 days after Bayard Rustin has come to town as an emissary of the War Resisters League and the Fellowship of Reconciliation and Howard Thurman and other people, and the New York people who were supportive of the boycott from day one, and encouraged and then raised the budget for Bayard Rustin to go to Montgomery and explore it. And he went there about the last week, the last several days of January. He's in Montgomery. Coretta King knows him. Martin King does not know him. She went to Antioch College in Ohio, which was a hotbed of pacifism and activism against war and some against racism and whatnot. So she greets him cordially. He's under suspicion by others. He is especially disliked by the publisher of the Atlanta World, black newspaper, who is a conventional black leader and who is fairly anti-communist, whatever that means. And the reporter from the Atlanta World threatens King and Bayard Rustin with, if you don't get rid of him, we will expose his homosexuality. Because by that time, Bayard has had an arrest maybe on the West Coast and an arrest on the East Coast. There were 2 or 3 arrests that he had in his lifetime, because he did not hide his, he did not declare himself gay. That was way before that talk. But he did not hide his homosexuality. He lived it to the best of his ability. So, in that tense scene, there was a black reporter from the Atlanta World, and I think he took orders from Atlanta and said, if you don't get rid of Bayard Rustin. So the story is that Bayard Rustin left Montgomery in the trunk of a Cadillac because of the threats that were being made against his being there. You have to recognize now that 1955 is only 10 years in the development of the severe anti-communism that is like racism. It's like male chauvinism. And I said that in the 60s. So, I mean, I saw that and heard that. So, that's my understanding. Up to that time, January